The drone was still over Beirut when the ceasefire was already dying. In southern Lebanon, strikes were landing in sequence, not randomly, but with the cold rhythm of a force that had never really left the picture. In Washington, the language was implementation, pilot zones, de-escalation. On the ground, nobody hearing that engine overhead would have called it peace. Because this was not just a ceasefire under pressure. It was a test of who actually controlled the map, the timing, and the right to decide what counted as a violation. And when Israel resumed heavy strikes across Lebanon, the most important thing that broke was not the paper agreement. It was the illusion that the agreement had created sanctuary. If you read this only as another exchange of fire, you miss the real story. The visible violence mattered. The dead, the destruction, the political shock, all of that mattered. But underneath it was something even more dangerous, a gray zone contest over information dominance. Who sees first? Who confirms faster? Who can keep flying, tracking, sorting, and fixing targets while still claiming to be inside the logic of enforcement? That is where this episode becomes much more than a headline. Because Hezbollah, Lebanon, Israel, Washington, and Tehran were not arguing over one simple ceasefire line. They were fighting over a much harsher question. When the shooting pauses, who still owns the kill chain? To understand why the latest strikes landed with such force, you have to go back just far enough to see the trap hidden inside the diplomacy. The new ceasefire language was presented as a framework for implementation. Hezbollah operatives would halt fire. Armed elements would be pushed out from the area between the Israeli border and the Litani River, roughly 30 kilometers to the north. The Lebanese armed forces would assume exclusive control inside pilot zones. More talks would follow. On paper, that sounded like structure. In reality, it was structure with teeth missing. Because Hezbollah was not truly at the table in a way that guaranteed compliance. Because Israel was already holding ground inside a self-declared security strip. Because previous ceasefire attempts had been repeatedly violated. And because the side that retained the better intelligence picture was always going to interpret ambiguity in its own favor. That is the key. A ceasefire only works when both sides lose room to improvise. This one left room everywhere. And Israel knows how to weaponize room. Listen to the sequence. First came a partial arrangement. Beirut's southern suburbs would not be hit broadly if Hezbollah stopped firing into northern Israel. Then came the broader US-backed language about implementation, pilot zones, and non-state actors being excluded from southern territory. But the framework did not solve the core problem. It merely exposed it. Hezbollah wanted the political value of resistance without surrendering its operational relevance. Israel wanted the tactical freedom to keep degrading Hezbollah while avoiding the diplomatic cost of saying the ceasefire was meaningless. So the ceasefire became something darker than a pause. It became a contested filter through which every drone, every rocket, every ground movement, every radar return, and every unexplained signature could be reclassified as justification. That is not stability. That is an armed argument over who gets to define reality first. And in modern war, that matters more than the public statement. Picture the human level for a second. Not the speech. Not the press conference. A Lebanese officer in the south hears the strike report stacking up town by town. A drone appears over Beirut. Somewhere inside Hezbollah's network, men are trying to understand whether this is surveillance, deterrent theater, or the opening of a larger kill chain. An Israeli operations room is doing something much less emotional and much more decisive, correla. Ting tracks, sorting intent, matching intelligence to target folders, and deciding which action can be justified as response rather than escalation. That is the humiliation built into gray zone dominance. The weaker picture is not always the side with fewer weapons. It is the side that can no longer tell whether the other side is watching, tracking, waiting, or already committed. And Hezbollah has been living inside that uncertainty for months. By the time these latest strikes hit, this was already a pattern. On one of the heaviest days of the war, Israel reportedly hit more than 100 Hezbollah-linked sites in roughly 10 minutes. Later, more than 120 airstrikes were reported in another major wave as ground forces pushed beyond the forward security line. That matters not just because of the scale, but because of what scale does psychologically. It tells the other side that target generation is not collapsing. It tells them the bank is still full. It tells them their signatures are still being found. And once the enemy believes that, every movement becomes heavier. Every transmission feels dangerous. Every convoy, launcher, safe house, or liaison node starts to look temporary. That is how air power becomes political pressure without needing total war. Israel did not need to prove that every Hezbollah cell had been exposed. It only needed to prove that enough had. Enough to make the entire network doubt its own invisibility. This is where the title gets interesting. Israel just broke the ceasefire, sounds like the central event is the decision to strike. But operationally, the more revealing question is why Israel believed it could strike hard and still keep the strategic initiative. The answer is not mystery. It is architecture. Persistent surveillance over southern Lebanon and Beirut. Intelligence sharing through a US-led monitoring mechanism. Ground presence inside a buffer-like strip that compresses warning time. A side arrangement that, at least from Israel's perspective, preserved the right to act against imminent threats or violations. And a Lebanese state apparatus still too divided, too constrained, or too politically fragile to impose a monopoly of force in the south fast enough to change the equation. In other words, Hezbollah could reject the framework in public. Israel could ignore that rejection in practice. Because one side was arguing over legitimacy. The other was still flying the sensors. That is the midpoint most viewers miss. This was not simply a ceasefire failing. It was a ceasefire being used as an information battlefield. The public saw diplomacy and then explosions. The operators saw an unresolved competition over verification, compliance, and strike authority. And once you understand that, the latest wave of strikes looks less like a sudden emotional rupture and more like a message. Not just to Hezbollah. To Lebanon's government. To Washington. To Tehran. And to every regional actor watching the gap between formal agreements and actual enforcement. The message was brutal in its simplicity. If the mechanism cannot constrain Hezbollah, then it will not constrain Israel either. That is a gray zone statement. It does not always require a massive invasion. It does not need a triumphant speech. It only needs repeated demonstrations that one side can act faster than the political process can object. Now watch how the military logic tightens. Hezbollah's problem is not only that Israel can strike. It is that Hezbollah cannot easily restore deterrence without creating the very pretext Israel wants. A rocket barrage into northern Israel may show defiance, but it also confirms the argument that armed infrastructure south of the Litani remains active. A drone crossing the border may be tactically modest, but once detected, it shortens the path from suspicion to authorization. A refusal to recognize negotiations may preserve ideological purity, but it does not BLI. End the aircraft overhead. This is the cage. The more Hezbollah insists it remains relevant, the more it feeds the targeting logic of the side trying to grind it down. And the more Israel acts inside that logic, the more every pause starts to look conditional on Israeli tolerance rather than mutual restraint. That is strategic embarrassment. Not because a speech was contradicted. Because an entire deterrence image begins to rot. The irony is that none of this requires magical electronic warfare. Too many people hear information dominance and picture science fiction, invisible beams, screens going black, missiles turning around in midair. Real dominance is colder than that. It is passive collection. Pattern analysis. Knowing which site went dark too suddenly. Knowing which road became busy after a warning. Knowing when a civilian movement has military timing. Knowing when a hostile aircraft, drone, or launcher appears just long enough to justify a response. And, just as important, forcing the other side to assume that any of those things may already be known. That assumption does half the work by itself. When a network stops trusting its own concealment, it starts making worse decisions. That is why these strikes matter beyond the blast radius. They did not just hit positions. They hit confidence. And once confidence goes, command becomes slower. Local actors improvise. Political messaging drifts away from battlefield reality. Allies begin asking whether the armed group they backed can still shape events, or whether it is now mostly absorbing them. There is another layer here, and it makes the situation even more dangerous. Israel's latest posture suggests it is no longer treating the Lebanese front as a discrete border problem. It is treating it as one theater inside a wider confrontation tied to Iran, proxy pressure, and northern deterrence. That widens the logic of retaliation. It also lowers the threshold for cross-domain interpretation. A rocket from Lebanon is no longer just a rocket from Lebanon. A drone over the border is no longer an isolated tactical event. Everything becomes linked to a bigger architecture of pressure. And when conflicts are interpreted that way, ceasefires become fragile by design, because every local signal can be folded into a regional argument. That is why one side can say, "We are enforcing." The other can say, "You are violating." And both can act like they are answering the same event while actually fighting two different wars in their heads. One is the war of statements. The other is the war of systems. The second one usually wins. So what was the decisive choice here? Not the first launch. Not the first public rejection. The decisive choice was Israel's decision to preserve freedom of action even while the diplomatic framework was being sold as active. That matters because it denies Hezbollah the one thing a damaged armed movement desperately needs after a costly campaign, a predictable recovery space. No recovery space means no clean reconstruction of positions. No clean reconstruction means no easy reconstitution of deterrence. No easy deterrence means every future threat has to be made from a weaker psychological posture than before. That is not total victory. But it is a form of dominance. And it is exactly the kind gray zone warfare aims for, not always destroying the enemy outright, but exposing that the enemy cannot move, hide, or coerce with the confidence it claims. Of course, this comes with enormous risk. A system built on recurring punitive strikes can drift into permanent instability. Civilian costs mount. Miscalculation becomes easier. Local commanders start making decisions inside shrinking time windows. One strike too close to Beirut, one barrage too large into northern Israel, one killed commander too senior, one mistaken assessment too aggressive, and the gray zone disappears. Then it becomes open war again. That is the final danger in what just happened. The same architecture that gives one side confidence can also seduce it into overconfidence. If Israel believes it can indefinitely manage Hezbollah through surveillance, selective strikes, buffer zones, and political ambiguity, it may be right for a while. But every successful enforcement model creates its own temptation. To press harder. To widen criteria. To strike one more node. To assume the other side is too degraded to gamble. That is usually when the region reminds everyone that damaged actors are still capable of desperate choices. So yes, the ceasefire was broken, or exposed, or perhaps never fully born in the first place. But the deepest lesson is not about the headline language. It is about control. In modern conflict, the side that sees more does not just target better. It negotiates from the sky. It writes the meaning of violations. It decides whether a pause is real, temporary, or already over. And when that happens, the battlefield does not wait for diplomacy to catch up. It moves first, speaks later, and leaves everyone underneath listening for the next engine in the dark.